In this episode, I'm going to talk about the difference between last week's release and curved bind and this week's release and straight bind. So this is the curved bind that we've been working with, release and a curved bind, release and a curved bind. And if you haven't done the other exercises already, I'd encourage you to go back and have a look at those. So this week, we're going to do a variation of the release with the curved bind. And it's the release and then a straight bind, release and a straight bind, and a release, a straight bind, release, and a straight bind, release, and a straight bind, and a release, and a straight bind. And here, like we did last week, where we went and did an intersecting line across our first line, we're going to do the same this week with a straight line and the straight bind. So here it looks like this. So in this intersection between the first line and our second line that intersects, there has to be a good amount of attention. And in the book, Kutzley talks about how there's a special attention arising between the releasing and the binding. And I would say there's certainly a special attention arising when you have the intersection of the second line with the first line. That's when you really have to find your power of center, as he describes it in the book. And also he calls it your ego. So you really have to be very concentrated in order to create what is supposed to become a harmonious band. And the aim, of course, of form drawing is always to be rhythmic and not to be actively rigid, as Kutzley talks about in the book. It just basically means that you're rhythmic in what you're doing so that you're not active but rigid in your action. So you're not just maintaining the same speed as you're drawing and thereby being rigid, but rhythmic, always being rhythmic. So you're releasing and binding, releasing and binding, releasing and binding, releasing and binding. And basically what the book suggests, because this is a difficult exercise, is that you can do a sort of loose framework. Not loose in the sense that you're not paying attention to how it looks, because that's very important, but loose as in a light framework which is supposed to dissolve into your form. So what you can do is you can draw, the framework is basically this, that you have your, so what I'd like to call a mountain shape that runs through your form. And the book suggests that you might like to draw that lightly so that it can dissolve into your shape as you're drawing it, because maybe initially, maybe you find this is an easy form drawing exercise to do, but you may also find that some help would be nice, in which case what you want to do is you want to create this zigzag shape And the important thing when you're creating this zigzag shape is that your zigzags are the same height and basically roughly the same width. And it is important because otherwise your shapes up here, when you're creating them, are not going to be harmonious. So what you then do once you've created your zigzag shape, in order to help you and you make sure it's sort of all the same line, is you then use your uphill to guide your first line. Personally, I find is basically making my drawing kind of rigid, but you may find that it's helpful for you, in which case go ahead and use it. It can certainly be a good help initially if you're finding that it's very difficult to draw the form so that it becomes harmonious. Once you've drawn your form, and once you've practiced your form maybe with the zigzag, then I would strongly suggest that you go back and then you practice drawing this freehand so that you get the rhythm that you need. Of course, you may also find that you can use the zigzag to draw rhythmically with. It's just I prefer doing it freehand. The thing about this particular form is also that you have to be quite attentive to how wide your release and bind is at the bottom, because it does make quite a big difference to what your form will end up looking like. So, for instance, you might find it difficult if you're the type of person who might draw like this. As you can see, my release and bind are quite close together. You might not be aware, and it's fairly vertical as well. You might not be aware initially of why that would cause you a problem, but here the opening of each of these shapes is quite narrow, and that makes a difference to when you want to draw your intersection line. And I'll show you by drawing the other possibility, which would be, I'll draw it a bit flatter here as well so we can really see the difference. Right, so here you can see the opening is quite a lot wider. It's almost a bit kind of like a hill, whereas here it's much more monotonous and narrow. So what does it look like when we try and draw the intersection line? It would look something like this. And what does the bottom line look like if we try and draw something here? Basically, you can see the difference. It's up here, we have these kind of long, narrow heart shapes. as opposed to much wider and broader and lower heart shapes down here, where we have more width in between each of the shapes. And I'll maybe just draw it up with a red crayon to try and show the difference. So here you have a very narrow, very steep mountain, very steep hill. Whereas with the bottom one, your hill is much flatter. The mountain is much flatter. I hope you can see it a bit more clearly here. And it will make a difference to you in terms of how easy it is for you to draw. Try and play with different varieties of how open your hills are and how steep they are, and see the difference it makes. I'm sure you'll find there's a big difference. So I hope you've liked this week's exercise, and I'll be back next week with more exercises for you.